Hello and welcome to Taking Liberties Radio, episode 35. My name is Lee. This week I'm joined, of course, by Vickers in Canberra.
Yo.
But also joining us from the wonderful place of Queensland, from LibertyWorks, we've got Justin Campbell.
G'day.
We're going to be talking about Queensland elections. We're going to talk about the LDP. And yeah, so let's get into it. So Queensland is having an election this weekend. In the pre-discussion we had, Justin, you said you were very uninspired, and having looked over some of the election promise breakdown on the ABC's website, it looks just like a bit of a spend-a-thon. So how about you sort of run us through exactly kind of what's going on?
Yes, okay. Well, you've got an accidental premier with Anastasia Palaszczuk in at the moment. She's a member for Inala, which is a very safe Labor seat. When Campbell Newman won, Labor basically got wiped out, so they had a very small team, and she was leader. And then because Campbell Newman was so unpopular, they managed to get a landslide and win, which was very surprisingly. But now you've got this accidental premier being premier, and she's really at most should have been like transport minister, tourist minister. Like, she's just not cut out for the job. And on the LNP side, you've got Tim Nicholls, who's been at it for a long time. He's been there a long time. He was before Campbell Newman, after Campbell Newman, and if he's a Jeb Bush type. Like, if he was up against Trump, Trump would have called him low energy, and he's like, oh, we won't cut anything. Don't worry, I'm nothing like Campbell Newman, and the whole campaign is focused around, is Tim Nicholls Campbell Newman, and he says he's not.
For the benefit of those of us who are don't remember the cruel and terrible despotic reign of Campbell Newman, how about you sort of go through like what was his sort of style? Because I mean, it was very unusual. Like, he wasn't even a member of parliament before he sort of ran to become premier. He then came into the parliament. So how about you sort of go through just kind of that background? Because I don't really know it. I just know that he lost.
Yeah, okay. So, look, I don't think he was as cruel and all these sorts of things as made out. Like, he cut the funding for the literary awards, and all of the left went after him for that. But he just cut the public service quite significantly, and by significantly, it was an actual cut, which is quite unusual. Normally, they just slow the growth. But then he made enemies in other ways. Like, he really went after the bikies, and he just made lots and lots of enemies, too many. And he had a very authoritarian style, and that seemed to work for him as when he was Lord Mayor, because he used to be Lord Mayor of Brisbane. And when he was Lord Mayor, basically he built same thing. He built his own team that wasn't the normal team for the council people, and he came in and he just took over basically, and that seemed to work for him as Lord Mayor. But in the state level, it didn't. And when you look at state politics in Queensland, I mean, the people who have a real vested interest in it are the unions, and there's an awful lot of government-owned corporations in Queensland as well. So he just made so many enemies that he lost, and that's how this premier, who really wasn't, this Anastasia Palaszczuk, who really wasn't ready to be premier, won. It would have been great if she'd nearly won and maybe got a bit more experience, but she won, and I don't think she's ready. And she's got this super left-wing deputy, Jackie Trad, who's in the seat of South Brisbane, and she's looking like she might lose that seat to the Greens. So in the seat of South Brisbane, it's a seat between one kind of communist versus another kind of communist.
Fair enough. And so,
Battle of the Communists.
Yeah, I know. Like, you gotta love. Well, I mean, Greens won in the Northcote by-election, didn't they? So it seems like they're doing all right at the moment. What has been like Anastasia Palaszczuk's, like, what has she done in the last sort of 3-4 years? Like, what have been some of her achievements, which we put in quotation marks because we're libertarians and we think they're all bigger, more failings than achievements. But in the public
Well,
domain, like what is it that she's done? I mean, obviously there's a lot to do with the Adani coal mine. That's the thing that seems, so that's about the only thing that seems to sort of leak into the broader Australian electoral political context.
Yeah.
But...
Well, this is what makes me tempted to vote for her, actually. And most people see this as a weakness, but I see it as great, is that she's really weak, that they're going to introduce these lockout laws, and people campaign about it, and they back down. And now we've just got some stupid thing where they scan your IDs and you know, like they blacklist you if you're a troublemaker and things like that. But you know, they back down on this policy, and they also back down on Uber as well. So they're really ramping it up with Uber, and they increased the fines. But then the LNP put through an amendment. There was going to be fines and increased demerit points. So basically, if you drove an Uber, you're a good risk of losing your driver's license had the law passed. But then they blinked, and they just passed it, so you only got an increased fine and not the demerit points. And once they did that, you knew the taxi council were going to lose, because Uber has deep enough pockets to pay fines. But what they can't do is they can't give people their driver's license back. Yeah. So to me, the fact that, you know, they're so scared of being Campbell Newman that actually both sides, they're very responsive to campaigning, which for LibertyWorks is a good thing. But the other thing about the Adani thing, the Adani is very complicated, because it's very complicated for Labor, because they're looking at losing some of these seats to the Greens, or, you know, being dependent on Green preferences in some of these key seats in Brisbane. But then up north in Mackay and some of these other places, they're losing. A lot of people lost their jobs. The economy up there is very poor. You know, it's in a very bad way since the decline in the mining boom. And those people up there need this coal mine. At least that's the way they see it anyway. And so you've got kind of Anastasia Palaszczuk running these ads saying, you know, we're the party for renewables and all of that kind of thing. And on the other hand, they're subsidising a giant coal mine in the north of Queensland. It makes no sense at all.
Yeah, right. Okay. So they're offering what's exactly? So this is the Adani mine, correct? Yeah. So what, like, how is the Queensland government propping it up? Because I mean, I knew they were having issues with loans from banks. Like the protesters were going against the banks, trying to target the banks to stop them from lending the money. But how is the government?
No. The banks did refuse to lend the money. Every bank in Australia refused to lend the money. And to be fair, they didn't cite the problem with any of the state governments. They cited the problem with the federal government. They basically said there's a sovereign risk of this mine basically even starting up, because there's certain conditions that are required by states as you make these mines. You're not only meant to dig out everything, you're also meant to fill it back up and make good. You know, like put up a park or whatever it is. Yeah, and that's kind of like that's typically how they organize the arrangements to allow for these mines. So what happened is there was a sovereign risk created by, if I recall correctly, both the Greens and Labor saying that they would shut down the mine. And the only way to secure that loan was basically the government to back it to a certain degree, at which point, once the infrastructure was built, they would get the government would get all its money back. Or it would lose a significant chunk of money over and beyond what they'd invested for that infrastructure if they decided to shut down the mine, basically reversing the sovereign risk problem back onto the sovereign, right?
Yeah.
As obviously should be. But here's the thing. That's a pointless thing to do because, as we've experienced in Victoria, Labor governments just don't give a fuck. They will just pay the money.
Yeah.
They're absolutely fine with cronyism if it wins elections.
Yeah, Well, I believe the Queensland government's going in for some of the train lines and things like that go. But look, to be honest, the whole Adani thing kind of confuses me. It's there's so many aspects to it. I haven't followed it closely. My view of it is that is a libertarian view. I don't think we should be subsidising it. I think there should be a clear, transparent policy on these approvals. And you get lots of people on the conservative side who are very concerned about the Argentinian what's it called, the water table. They're very
Artesian.
That's what I'm trying to say. Artesian basin. And so it's not just a left wing thing. Like, lots of people on the right are concerned about it as well. And I don't know who's right and who's wrong about all of this. I'd like to think that
if those people on the right are concerned about it, they should be pushing for more property rights, especially on the water table. All of these problems exist in Australia because we don't have property rights, right?
Yep.
At their core, all of our problems stems from the fact that property, right, is communal in Australia, and that's the real problem.
Yeah.
How would you? What about? But you're talking about a big basin.
Yeah.
So that's a massive thing, right? It's going under lots of people's land. So how would you manage that?
Yeah, if someone buys the entire thing as one big thing.
Yeah, and then if there's leakage, you just sue them. So so if the whole basin, or even if it was like, say everybody else above it gets an ownership stake, so it's collectively, it's corporately owned by all the people who sit above the basin. Then the management of the basin would sue any pollution that is leached into it by any pollution that makes its way into the thing by a mine.
Yep.
Right.
That's probably not going to happen. I mean, that's So
no, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
No, none of our suggestions will ever happen. If you take a look at it, the vast majority of Australia is publicly owned land, right?
Yeah.
We're one of, like, seriously, there is more publicly owned land in Australia than there is in China, and that's a communist country we're talking about, right? No, seriously, if you're having trouble accepting what I just said, go to Wikipedia, look up percentage of publicly owned land. The only country that owns more as a percentage of public owned land than Australia is New Zealand, and the fact is, right, both of us, like, if you saw those kind of statistics, like, communist countries, like Venezuela has less publicly owned land than we do.
Well, I mean, and part of that is just because nobody lived here, or very few people lived here when it was established, and so by default, all land is owned by the Crown and then dispensed out. Where, I mean, you can see that with the US, where the eastern half of the US is more or less almost entirely privately owned, and then the western half of the US, like particularly states like Nevada, I think is 98% federal land or something crazy like that.
No. In fact, I can bring up the map if you ever want to look at it. So less than 4% of all land across the United States is public land. It's a tiny percentage.
But sure, but like, I think in some parts of the country, it's a very high percentage of land.
Sure, but nothing to the extent of that. Yeah, nothing to the extent of that. Highest.
Is that proving a problem for building the wall? Because a lot of that land is privately owned.
Yes, pretty much.
Yeah.
And they're trying to use eminent domain to try and grab up that land, but there's limitations. See, here's the thing: when you got high property ownership, it's really hard to do things like that. And that's why I'm like, the biggest problem with Australia is there's not enough private property.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So just to jump back into this. So on the west, so if you're talking sort of the western part of the US, Nevada is, I'm looking at an article that says 85.5% of Nevada is federally owned. California 45.3%. Alaska 69%.
Federally owned.
Yep, federally owned. Where Texas is 1.9%. I think that's Minnesota. It's 2.7%. Like, literally, you can divide the country into half. I'll send you. I'll put a link.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So the federal government owns 47% of the land in the West.
Yeah, in the West. Yeah, yeah. So like that's what I think. Like in certain parts of the US, and that's because the federal government was a thing when all those states were established. Where maybe before it was a bit more complicated. You know, sort of you're talking about pre-Civil War, so the feds aren't as powerful as they were.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's getting away from the topic at hand.
It does segue to a issue that the Greens have announced a very crazy property rental policy. So they want to.
This is the 5-year plan for production of. Yeah, I know what you mean. Keep going.
Yeah. So Stephen Campbell wrote an article about this, which actually followed on a theme that I'd wrote about several months ago. Actually, he called it Brisbane's New Green Ghetto, and basically they want to build a whole bunch of public housing. And they've got this policy, a home for all, and apparently, according to them, it'll cost $60 billion. I can tell you,
which is like probably more than almost any other project any government in Australia has ever even accomplished, like even committed to.
Except for the NBN.
Well, I think the NBN initially wasn't even that much when they committed to it.
Well,
obviously it's going to be more, but like when the initially stated price tag was not $60 billion. It was more than that.
No, the initial price tag for that was $43 billion, but we've covered their sneakiness as to how they arrived at that.
I don't dispute that, but just like, given the brazenness of politicians to be a bit generous with like their stated, like how big their policies are, this is like to just openly admit there's $60 billion, which is this is one state. Like anyway, it's
but
crazy.
Just to put that into context, the subs program, which is running for 40 years to deliver 12 subs, that's going to cost us allegedly $40 billion. So, I mean, if you want to put it into context,
that's the government which has all the money.
Yeah. So, firstly, I want to see the numbers on how they plan to pay for $6 billion for that many houses. The second thing is...
Come on.
But they don't have the ability to go after the rich people. But the second question is really, I mean, they want to build a shit ton of public housing, right? But those housing doesn't exist in a bubble, right? People have houses. People don't just have houses. They have communities. They have like an area where they go shopping. They've got areas where they commute for work. You know, what I'm saying is you can't centrally plan housing without like either severely getting involved with a whole bunch of other stuff or not getting involved to the point where it's utterly meaningless for everyone.
So according to the Greens website, they're going to fund it by long-term government bonds. This will be supplemented with revenue from the proposed increase to mining royalties and an introduction of tax on vacant properties, which will provide $10 billion boost during the first 10 years. Okay? The bonds will be repaid over 20 years, taking advantage of low interest rates available for public borrowing.
I like the idea of the vacant property tax, but like you can't really administer it, right? It's
like the idea of a vacant property tax.
In the sense that
compared to the other stupid taxes that could
to the other, as in like it's comparison to every other stupid tax you could have. I like the idea of vacant property tax in the sense that it's the hardest to administer, and quite frankly, like I just have no idea how they could possibly do it.
I'm sorry, I've caught up now. I've caught up.
Yeah. I don't say we actually like the idea of it. We're just saying it's dumb and it's dumb.
Yeah, you like the idea of a tax that won't raise any revenue. Gotcha.
Yeah. Sorry if that wasn't clear.
I think there's a deeper issue. There's a deeper issue here, though, because several months ago I wrote an article, Queensland Greens go full commie and abolish private property. And it was all about giving renters a lot more rights, making it a requirement that landlords have to do 12 leases, and would only be able to terminate a lease under reasonable grounds. So this is an ongoing trend that's popular in the inner city with millennials, of this seeing rental properties as some kind of public good that the government can just go in and take.
They do realise if you impose these kind of conditions, it gets harder to actually rent properties, right?
Yeah.
Well, see, the thing is...
Well, I don't think they do.
Well, they probably don't care. So, I mean, we should also add that they plan to build 1 million houses within 30 years. So, the first 10 years, the goal is 200,000. And then the following 20 years, they're hoping to build another 800,000 homes. So, just to put the complete scale of the project. I mean, one of the issues...
I like the housing number. Yeah, I do. No, seriously,
Nice
1 million
number.
year. Yeah, no, I'm not saying because it's a nice round number. So currently, right, annually there are 120,000 housing dwelling approvals countrywide.
Yep.
Right? That's across the entire country. What they're telling me is that they alone are planning to go 80% on top of the national average, right? And on top of that, do that repeatedly for 20 years. I like that idea a lot. That would do a shit ton of work. If they pull it off, that would do a shit ton of work at reducing the price of housing in Queensland.
Yeah.
Oh, well, there you go.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, it would, except that they'd completely annihilate their economy doing... I mean, like...
No, they'd completely annihilate the housing investment economy.
Oh, well,
builders are going to fucking love that shit.
Yeah, that's true. But like their budget, I mean, $60 billion in a state that probably doesn't have $60 billion ever for anything.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Don't get me wrong. It's going to be an economic disaster.
Yeah,
but the point is, I like that number.
It's going to end up like Mad Max, but everybody will have a house, so it's all good.
Yeah.
Also, they promise to give people a home for life. So because this is actual communism, once you're in there, they basically can't get rid of you.
I think there's an issue here. My grandfather used to say, because he was a lifelong Labor voter, he said the problem with Labor is that they'd build people up, and then they'd end up voting Tory. So in other words, all the policies Labor has were so successful that people got so comfortable that they started to see themselves as Liberal Party voters.
Yep.
And I really think, sometimes I think the conservative side of politics can be so short-sighted, not addressing issues, policies that are creating a housing bubble and an asset bubble, that they're creating a generation of socialists.
Yep.
Because
the policies of each one of them ends up creating the next generation of people for the other side.
It's
right?
true. Yes. Yeah.
So, for example, if you there have been loads of studies done showing that the next generation of people tend to be conservative leaning, and it's just because the left wing has now taken over the institutions. They are now the man, and they're not kind of cool. People don't see their policies as cool. They see them as intrusive and authoritarian. Huh?
It's pretty bad when the cool dudes, this Canadian psychology professor, who sounds like Kermit the Frog. He's the
He does sound like Kermit the Frog, but
he's the cool dude that all the young people are because they're rebelling against the left-wing establishment.
Pretty much. But then again, the left-wing establishment isn't that different from the right-wing establishment from 15 years ago. Yeah. Whenever someone takes over the establishment, they all tend to rule the same way.
That's true.
Yeah.
So
that's true.
We should probably, because we only got sort of 5-10 minutes to talk. So let's talk about the LDP, because they've had some issues. I mean, as much as the fun it is to dump all over the Greens all the time for any reason whatsoever, we should talk about something consequential, which is the LDP couldn't even get registered for this election because of the nature of the rules in Queensland. So how do you sort of go through that? You've written an article which is on LibertyWorks' website, which we should say is libertyworks.org.au. It's called Queensland Undemocratic Electoral Process. So yeah,
That's right. Okay, so this is not anything new. This isn't just me having a whinge because I'm this massive fan of the LDP. The Australian Conservatives also couldn't get registered. And back in the 2000s, I was a member of the Australian Democrats. At a time when we had a sitting senator, we couldn't get registered in the state of Queensland. The rule says that you need 500 members, but the way that they work that is that they then send mail outs to all of your members, and they need a certain response rate to confirm that you have those 500 members. And in practice, I've heard numbers thrown around like 1,000, 1,500, what you really need to get there. And the problem is with the small parties is that they gradually climb up to this 500 number. Like, it's a big ask. Like, the average meeting, 20 people show up. You know, like, and there are a lot of people who just never respond back, or they forget they signed up. And it seems like the only people who can get registered are the big parties, but also, oddly enough, really populist parties that they seem to be able to, like, because they've got these really motivated people, they go and sign up thousands of people in a very short period of time and somehow manage to get across the line. So, but it's ridiculous. I mean, Queensland doesn't have an upper house. There's actually no reason to have strict rules around what political parties can run. If you've got an upper house, so you can see why that you don't want to confuse people and you don't want this massive Senate paper. But in Queensland, you're just talking about, like, say me, I would have run as a candidate. I would have run as the local LDP candidate. So for the 5 people who vote LDP in the Cedar Pine Rivers, they could have voted for me.
Yeah.
But
I mean, presumably
that
they have that Queensland doesn't have an upper house is why this sort of thing would get through. Because if you think about the status quo of most parliaments is you've got this upper house where there's a handful of crossbenchers who get very upset if you try to make it very hard for them to get re-elected. Yeah, you know, it's probably a nature. I mean, you see similar sorts of things with like the Libertarian Party in the US. I mean, now they've got ballot access in all 50 states, but it's taken them a very long time because there have been these sorts of rules in place to try and keep them out.
You know what would make it interesting is if you had write-in candidates. Then you could just, like, you know, you've got the ones that are registered, and then you can just add in one if you don't fucking care. Yeah. It's like, hey, or you could write in your own here.
Batman.
Yeah. I voted for my cat one time.
You know what? I actually reckon your cat would make a fantastic parliamentarian.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's not a hard, like you know.
That's not me being sarcastic. Yeah, I'm just like, yeah, it probably would.
Most cats would be better parliamentarians.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh well, even dogs, man. Seriously, I would trust my neighbour's cat over anyone that's currently in Parliament.
You can just measure their votes by putting out bowls with like yes or no and see which one they go to. A bit like the octopus that was predicting the World Cup results, where they just sort of put it in the tank and then reveal 2 sources of food and see who it goes for. Just do that with cats.
While we're on the topic of Queensland, quickly, with the same-sex marriage plebiscite, I think one thing I do get annoyed with is this idea that Queensland's really different. It's this like super conservative place.
It's not super conservative. It's just really retarded, like 50 years back.
Wow, no bias there, Vickers.
And look, I mean, our vote was one of the lowest for yes, so it still leans more right than other states, but except for
Western Sydney had you beat.
Yeah.
I mean,
but you know, like, it wasn't much. Sorry.
Oh no, you finish.
There wasn't much in it, you know. So I see a lot of, mostly from ex-Queenslanders, to be honest, like people like Helen Dale and so on, who haven't lived in the place since you know, Joe Bialka-Peterson was premier.
That's who I was going to bring.
And the truth is like Peter Beattie was premier and Anna Bligh was premier for a long time, and basically in that time we became like a mini New South Wales. You know, like We're really I think the idea that Queensland's this super different place, it just isn't true.
I mean,
I agree with
really
him.
It has to do with Sir Joe, like that he sort of looms over the state in sort of in a historic sense, which is why Helen Dale. I mean, when you hear her talk about it, the place that she grew up in, Joe, the time when he was premier, and it did sound like. I mean, and then you got all the police corruption. Like, it did sound like a very different place to maybe how it is now. I mean, I've never lived there, so I can't say. So,
Yeah.
So you're saying there was a time in Queensland where there was a lot of police corruption, and there was a guy at the top who was basically running a pseudo-fascist state tin pot dictatorship, right?
Yeah.
If you told me that in those terms, I would say, why are we talking about Eddie Obeid and Christina Keneally?
I was waiting for the punchline.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's...
Yeah, well,
sorry.
that's true. I mean, you do look at New South Wales in the last 10 years and you think, like back in the days where everyone was laughing at Queensland, well, not really laughing anymore. Like, it's very, very, maybe not a bit less sort of rednecky, but it's still the same sort of corruption.
Yeah.
But I like the way that people outside of Brisbane in Queensland, they have like this slow way of talking.
Yeah.
And I appreciate it very much. It's just like, yes, take your time explaining that.
Yeah. No, I knew a guy from Mount Isa who he's talked the slowest I've ever met, but he was probably one of the quickest, had one of the quickest wits. So, like, he'd basically make fun of you in very clever ways at like half speed. It was an interesting combination. All right, well, we're just about running out of time. Well, two things. Maybe, is there anything else about the sort of Queensland electoral, the election that we should know about? Yeah, and then.
Well, I've got a bikie in my area.
Okay.
That's running as a candidate. So Gabe Buckley says he's a top bloke. So so I might vote for him. But I don't know. Like, it's just I think we've got this worrying trend where governments win and lose on not very big majorities. Like, they just sort of like sleepwalk into government and they're with no real agenda to change anything. And I think if government does change, because what could happen is it becomes a minority government and then One Nation backs the LNP. That could happen. But there won't be any great change.
Yep.
And that's unfortunate because Queensland has the highest debt of any state.
Yep. Actually, we haven't touched on the One Nation thing. So, like, what are some of their key platforms? Like, what are they sort of hoping to achieve? Because, I mean, presumably they're going to have the...
Got to keep out the mussies, man.
Well, I mean, obviously, apart from the general, hate the brown people kind of thing. But, like, is there anything specific that we're not...
Yeah, look, I feel really bad for that one family that runs a kebab shop in Fortitude Valley because when they kick out the Muslims from Queensland, all four of them will have to move.
Yeah, having said that, though, it's the LDP at a federal level's joined in on the kick out the Muslims too, or rather stop letting the Muslims in group. With the David Linehelm said, like, we got to be careful about who we let in based on this gay marriage vote. At which point I basically laughed and said, you can't. It's just like the guy who's let in Mark Latham into the party is telling us not that we need to be picky.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have to admit, like, I was very critical of the of aspects of the Yes campaign. I wrote quite a few articles about corporations lecturing people and all that kind of thing. But in the end, I voted yes, and I do find it very uncomfortable that we had Mark Latham out there campaigning for no.
Yes,
we had someone campaigning against increased freedom, and that's apparently meant to be our party.
Yep, and also when you have what's his name, David, on one side also campaigning for yes, I was just like, yeah, so this is... And there are people inside the LDP who unironically keep suggesting that he should be at the top of the ticket for the next run.
Yeah.
Yeah, so when I hear like, oh, we shouldn't be picky, I go like, oh, maybe the LDP should practice a little bit being more picky.
Yeah,
I mean,
yes.
I mean, Tim Wilson, I think I saw him, approvingly share an article by Judith Sloan about immigration today, which calling for less immigration. So, I think that's a genuine split amongst libertarians is what should be done about immigration. So yeah,
That's a topic for another day.
It is a topic.
No,
It is.
Yeah. No. I just wanted to take the opportunity to slam Mark Latham. That's all.
I don't have a problem with that ever, honestly. I don't think we actually had an episode where we talk about Mark Latham in the LDP, because I've talked about it about 50 million times in some of the groups we're all involved in, but I don't know if we've actually had it on this podcast.
As in,
particularly, should Mark Latham run for the LDP? Because that's the point. I think that's Mark Latham joining is one thing. I think him running for the LDP, particularly in the Senate.
Look, I would love to have those kind of topics, but like hasn't been the style of the show so far. We've never spoken about any pre-selection for any other party, so it would feel a little bit out of place.
I don't know. I mean, anyway.
But having said that, though, I'm
we should talk about this after the show once we finish recording. But I think we should. Anyway, so go, Justin.
Oh, I was just going to say, look, for me, I've never rated the LDP having much chance of ever winning, and for me, it's just sort of imported. I actually think the way we achieve our goals is by just going out in the real world and doing stuff. Building alternatives to government solutions, and I think the LDP's main purpose is just to give people who are liberal-minded, liberty-minded, something to vote for. And I think it'd be a real tragedy if we became just another, right-wing party.
Yep.
To try to win votes, which probably won't work anyway.
Now, before we wrap up, is there anything we should know about what's coming up for LibertyWorks? Like, do you want to give a bit of a spruik for LibertyWorks events or articles or?
Yeah, good question. Well, we do have something booked in, but I can't talk about it yet. So, not really. Just I'd encourage. Membership is free, so please go to the website, sign up. We're looking to do a Christmas party if you happen to be in Brisbane. And if you're interested in posting an article, reach out to us. We're very keen to hear from intelligent libertarian, or not even libertarians,
even like unintelligent people, because you've approached me to write an article for you guys. So
your article was great, and we had a great contrasting article about culture wars. That was very good.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. LibertyWorks, I've mentioned their website, also they're on Facebook. And actually should just, for the sake of fairness, so Tim Wilms, like the Unshackled, they're doing a live stream of the election results for this weekend. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, that's there. Thanks for joining us, Justin.
Thank you.
Of course. And we'll be back again next week.
Yep.